Hello there, my name is Rachel. Thank you for watching my video today on cleansing. This is part 5 of my 5-part cleansing series, and it's on how we can cleanse our minds for better health and well-being. The first portion of this discussion is we'll be talking about emotional stress toxicity and how that affects our body. And then later on in this discussion we'll talk about ways that we can combat the stress response and how we can optimize our health from that. As you can see in the picture here, we've got a little gauge. Our body has a little gauge. It probably doesn't look quite like this, but it does have a gauge, and at some point we reach a point of too much stress, the point where our body can no longer fight off illnesses and it can no longer heal itself because it's too preoccupied with dealing with the stress hormones that are influxing into our systems, which actually over a long period of time, if they're consistently secreted, can become toxic to us, and they can be poisonous, affecting everything from our digestion to our immune system and our states of well-being. Some common stresses for people would be issues in their relationships, family issues, could be something related to their career, financial concerns, it could be they're worried about retirement or other affairs that are going on, or they're stressed out with an overabundance of debt. So those are just a couple of things that might contribute to emotional stress. But if those things are what's causing our stress, then how can we possibly avoid them? Because we can't exactly just go be a hermit in the middle of nowhere and avoid family and avoid friends and ignore the fact that we need to make money in order to survive. I'm not saying that we should do that at all, but I'm just saying that it's important that we learn different ways in order to cope and deal with our stress. That way it doesn't overwhelm our physical bodies. And that is what we're going to focus on today. So I'd like to take a moment to talk a little bit about the autonomic nervous system. So why is the autonomic nervous system so important to this discussion? Well, because the autonomic nervous system is a portion of the nervous system that is in charge of automatic functions in the body, things that we don't have conscious control over necessarily. Although we'll talk a little bit more about this later and how we actually may have a roundabout way of controlling some of these processes. But first of all, the autonomic nervous system has two portions or two parts. There's the parasympathetic portion, which is in charge of the feed, breed, and rest response, and then the second portion is the sympathetic, and that is in charge of stress response or fight or flight. On this slide we can see that there's these nerve pathways coming out from the spine. And the ones here indicated in yellow are the portion of the autonomic nervous system that is sympathetic, in charge of fight or flight. And then the portions here in the blue or the greenish colored is indicative of the parasympathetic nerve pathways here. And then there's also a portion of them coming out here from the sacral area as well. So how does the autonomic nervous system work? So basically it works by feedback loops in the body. So hormones and nerve impulses send messages to the brain, and then the brain sends out signals back to the organs and the systems in the body based on what kind of stimuli influx to the brain, either from the physiological states of the organs or from stimulus from our thinking patterns in our brain. In this slide, I'm showing both portions of the autonomic nervous system, the parasympathetic on the left and the sympathetic here on the right. So the parasympathetic here on the left is showing that when it's in action, it constricts the pupils, so makes the small dark portion of the center of the eye contract and get smaller. And then next of all, it stimulates the flow of saliva. So saliva is important for our enzymes to break down food as we chew it. Also, it slows the heartbeat down, so it reduces stress on the cardiovascular system, and it constricts the bronchi. It stimulates peristalsis, which is the action of the stomach and the intestines moving foods and fluids throughout. And then it also stimulates the release of bile production in the liver, and it contracts the bladder. So again, that's the feed, breathe, and rest response the body has. But when we're stressed out, over here on the left, this is what happens. Our pupils dilate, so they get larger. And then the saliva is inhibited, so the production is way down, and actually that can cause symptoms of dry mouth. So sometimes people who have really dry mouths, it's indicative of them being in a sympathetic state or chronic stress. And then also there's an accelerated heartbeat, dilated bronchi, and then the inhibition of peristalsis and secretions, conversion of glycogen to glucose, so influx of glucose into the bloodstream, creating more energy. There's also secretion of adrenaline and noradrenaline hormones from the adrenal glands, and there's an inhibition of the bladder. So what happens when our sympathetic nervous system ends up getting stimulated over a long period of time and we don't get enough rest? Well, we end up in a state of chronic stress. And when this happens, the physiological effects are damaging to our bodies. Because in a stress response, like right over here on the right, you can see the stress stimulating the brain, and then that causes the brain and the HPA axis in between the hypothalamus, the pituitary, and the adrenal glands gets disrupted. So usually the pituitary sends signals out to the adrenal glands to produce cortisol and adrenaline when we're in a sympathetic state. But the problem is when cortisol production is constant and we get a constant influx of cortisol, at that point it becomes toxic to our bodies. Cortisol counters insulin by encouraging higher blood sugar and stimulating glucogenesis. So basically what this is doing is it's constantly putting glucose into our bloodstream, giving us more energy in a sense to fight off what we need to. But the problem is when we're in a constant state like this, it actually, if we don't have enough glucose in our system, then our bodies will actually start using up our muscle proteins and converting that then to glucose, and then we start losing our muscle mass, and then we will start putting weight on our abdominal area and cause greater risk for cardiovascular disease. Cortisol also prevents cells from losing sodium and accelerates the rate of potassium excretion. The reason for this is because in a stress state, the body has a harder time keeping the pH an optimal range because the metabolism is sped up so much. So the action of this is good in a sense that it temporarily helps the cells maintain their proper pH. But over a period of time, it can deplete the potassium in our cells, and that can result in very detrimental effects. Cortisol participates in an inhibitory feedback loop by blocking the secretion of corticotropin-releasing hormone, preventing the HPA axis interactions central to glucocorticoid secretion. So basically what this means is that when the feedback loop starts getting blocked between the HPA axis and the glucocorticoid secretions, then the brain doesn't know when to stop. And then we keep getting a further influx of these hormones that are poisonous to our system, and it's kind of like a vicious cycle then at that point, because the more that we have, the more that it blocks that situation, blocks that interaction in the HPA axis. Another thing cortisol can do is it blocks T cells from proliferating by preventing some T cells from recognizing interleukin signals. So basically what it's meaning is that the immune system is not able to communicate with itself as much as it needs to. In order to prevent illness and infections from taking over, the T cells have to be able to communicate with interleukin signal and be able to recognize the interleukin signals between the T cells and the other white blood cells. So when this is inhibited, then we have a greater tendency to get sick and have infection. And that's why a lot of people who are stressed out chronically tend to get sick very easily, because their immune system is basically blocked or confused because of the stress hormones preventing the communication there. Cortisol also stifles inflammation response due to inhibition of histamine secretions. So this is bad in a sense that your body is naturally designed to produce inflammation signals when it's injured or there's a problem going on or there's some toxic level that it needs to deal with. But if there isn't that communication and the histamine secretion is inhibited, then our body isn't able to send out proper cholesterol and antioxidants to the areas that are having issues in order to prevent the pain and to prevent the damage to the cells. Because inflammation only results when we have a situation where a toxin or something has damaged the cell. And so then the body gets put on alert in order to ward off whatever is causing that death or the cell death. But when we're chronically stressed, our bodies have a lack of communication in this sense. And so we could be doing things to our bodies that are extremely detrimental, but we wouldn't feel the effects as much from that. But then after the cortisol has diminished from our bodies, then we start feeling even worse, because we finally realized what we had done, well, way after the fact that had already been done. Some symptoms of cortisol toxicity may include impaired cognition, decreased thyroid function, and accumulation of abdominal fat, which itself has implications for cardiovascular health risks. Here's a picture here I'd like to show you, and this is the APH axis. And so this is just showing us, here we've got the hypothalamus, here we have the pituitary gland, or I should say right here, and those two, and actually what happens there between the hypothalamus and the pituitary is the communication between the nervous system and the endocrine system. So the endocrine system is the system that secretes your hormones. So this is where the brain communicates with the endocrine system. And so when we're in a stress state, and the portion of our brain that deals with emotional memory and stress response, which is the amygdala portion, actually sends a signal out to the hypothalamus, and then that ends up going to the pituitary and stimulates then the adrenal glands to produce cortisol and epinephrine and norepinephrine. But ideally, once these hormones are produced, themselves being in the bloodstream should communicate back to the hypothalamus in the brain that we've got enough. We've got them in the system. We're doing golden. But in a stress state like we had talked about in our previous slide here, where cortisol is actually inhibiting the interactions of central to the glucocorticoid secretions, then that feedback loop is stopped, and so the hypothalamus may still be getting stress signals from the amygdala portion of the brain and still telling the pituitary to tell the adrenal glands to produce cortisol. And so this is how we get wrapped up in this chronic stress cycle. It keeps repeating itself. So here I've got a video I'd like to show you, and it kind of gives us a nice visual of how this all works and how stress can be so detrimental to your bodies physiologically.
In a busy world with unending work and responsibilities piling up, stress can get to the best of us. But how bad is it for you, really? Can stress actually kill you? From a biological perspective, stress makes perfect sense. If you're about to get chomped on by a bear, your stress hormones better kick your butt into gear. But it turns out that your mortgage, unemployment, and looming exam all trigger the same stress response in your body. And unlike most animals, which eventually experience a major decrease in these hormones, humans can't seem to find the off switch. Even though it's not life and death, our psychological woes consistently bathe our bodies in these hormones, making our heart pound, muscles tense, and stomach turn. In Japan, they have the term koroshi, which literally translates to death from overwork. In what is now deemed an overworking epidemic, these individuals who are seemingly healthy and in their prime suddenly die. After being officially recognized and documented in Japan, these sudden heart attacks and strokes were quickly linked to stress. But how does stress cause this? Cortisol is one of the main stress hormones, which helps divert energy to where you need it and away from non-essential functions of the body. But with chronic stress exposure, problems arise. The immune system shuts down, inflammation is inhibited, white blood cells are reduced, and susceptibility to disease increases. Some evidence also suggests that prolonged stress may be involved in the development of cancer. When looking at the arteries of macaque monkeys, those under significant stress have more clogged arteries. This prevents blood from getting to the heart quickly during stress and can ultimately lead to heart attacks. The brain also takes a toll. When looking at mice exposed to stress, we see dramatically smaller brain cells with fewer branch extensions than normal mice. This is particularly prevalent in the areas associated with memory and learning, which may stir up some memories for you of those wonderful all-night study sessions. The acute stress and sleep deprivation can make it increasingly difficult to remember the things we want to. Perhaps the most telling story is in our DNA. We contain something called telomeres at the end of our chromosomes, which decrease in size with our age. Our video on aging here explains this process.
So as you can see, cortisol can be very toxic to our bodies, and over a long period of time it can really affect us physiologically. Some examples would be people with depression, anxiety, degenerative diseases, inflammation, weight gain, chronic fatigue. Those are some things that would be showing up after the effects of cortisol has been going on for a long period of time. Someone probably isn't going to feel it directly during the cortisol secretions, because cortisol almost reduces our ability to be able to sense these negatory feelings because of its protective nature on the body, so that we can do what we need to do and get it done in order to survive. But it's the after effects of cortisol that we usually experience negative feelings and negative physiological effects. It's not usually, I'm not saying that it's not there while the cortisol is influxed into the bloodstream. It's just not noticeable to us at that point because of the numbing effects that cortisol has on the body. So what causes stress really? I know we had talked about earlier how family issues, stress at work, stress at school, typical environmental factors can just put that extra stress on our bodies. And I guess I like to ask the question though, if stress is primarily caused by our environments alone, how is it that some people don't get stressed out as easily as other people? Even if they have very similar environments, their stress level is way less. And this can be partially explained by, genetics and also development throughout their childhood and how they learned how to cope and deal with stress. So genetics would affect things like our neurotransmitter levels in our brain. Those help us be able to cope with stress better if we have a balanced amount of those. So things like dopamine, so epinephrine, norepinephrine, acetylcholine, gamma aminobutyric acid, also serotonin. So those are just some examples of neurotransmitters that help balance out our moods and our actions. And our particular individualized levels of these neurotransmitters are based off our genetics partially, and the other portion is based off our current state of how we take care of our bodies. So that would be the amount of sleep that we get. It could also be related to our nutrition. Is our nutrition good? Are we eating toxic food? And is our lifestyle really involved with a lot of toxins that would have detrimental effects on our nutrition levels? So those would be some examples of the nature and how that affects how people are able to cope and deal with stress. The other portion I find is very interesting, the nurture portion, and that's where a person's environment during their development actually shapes how they're able to adapt to stress. So part of it being the genetics, the neurotransmitter levels, but the other portion being how we cope, how we deal with stress, our reaction to these environmental factors, these stressful situations. In some families, they are able to teach their children good ways to cope and deal with stress, but in abusive situations with children who are in a chronic state of stress and aren't given very good guidance, they may find it a lot harder in life to be able to cope and deal with stress because the way that their brain gets wired at that point. And a little bit later I'm going to show you a video that's very interesting about this topic, and it talks about how a child's brain is developed by the interactions that it has during those young years of its life. But I think it's also interesting because it allows us to realize that we can work on changing the way that we react and cope with situations by changing the way we think, and then that in turn will change the way that our brain functions, the way that the pathways that it travels in its typical responses to stress might be changed to a different response if we are habitually working at a different way to respond to a situation. But it's one of those things that takes a lot of time and it takes a lot of practice in order to overcome a negative way of dealing with stress. But it is good to know, and it gives us hope that we can make progress in that respect. So this is the video that talks about that, and I'm just going to click play here and I'll let you guys watch this. It is pretty interesting.
A lot of us are wondering, what is all this technology doing to our brains? I mean, we know that the brain changes throughout life based on experiences. In fact, watching this movie is reshaping connections in your brain right now. But since we humans are the ones creating and using this technology, maybe a better question to ask is, how are we shaping our brains? There's so much about the brain that we don't know. But there are some things we do know. You see, not long after we humans began thinking, we began thinking about ways to understand our own brains. One strategy thinkers have used throughout history is to compare the brain to the newest technology of their day. The brain is a clock, a switchboard, a steam engine, a machine, a computer. And we wondered, how can today's technology help us understand the brain in a new way? So we used that technology to ask people all over the world, How do you imagine the brain? It was amazing, like all these neurons firing ideas and images back to us from all over the world. And it was very clear. The internet, the most advanced technological system in the world, is such a strong framework to help understand the human brain, the most advanced biological system in the world. But then we thought about it a bit more. And since the internet is in such a young developmental stage, rapidly growing, constantly changing, forming billions of new connections all over the world, then maybe a stronger framework would be to compare it to a child's brain, which is in a similar stage of development, rapidly growing, constantly changing, and making billions upon billions of connections between different parts of the brain. So here's the question. If we say that the internet is in a similar developmental stage as a child's brain, then what can we learn by comparing them? Let's start with size. Obviously, the internet seems like a larger entity than a child's brain. But what does that mean in terms of our analogy? We could say that a neuron in the brain would be like a web page in the internet. So let's look at the number of neurons in a child's brain compared to the number of web pages on the internet. Well, a human at any age has about 100 billion neurons in the brain. But the internet has 10 times that, 1 trillion web pages. So with this analogy, the internet is bigger. So then, which of these networks is more complex? We could say a synapse in the brain, the connection point between two neurons, is like a hyperlink, the connection point between two web pages. So are there more connections in a child's brain or on the internet? Well, the internet has over 100 trillion links. And an adult's brain has 300 trillion links. But get this, a child's brain has a quadrillion connections, 10 times the number of connections of the entire internet. A child's brain has more connections than the entire internet. Yes, it blew our minds too. How is that even possible? Let's break it down. As we said, a baby is born with 100 billion neurons. But those quadrillion connections, they're not there yet. Those connections form at a very rapid speed during the first 5 years of life, at 700 to 1,000 new synapses per second. Those connections are created through every interaction a child has, and are important because they form the architecture of the brain. So every time you talk to and engage with a child, you are literally growing a brain, connecting the different parts of the brain, which allows for new ideas, insights, and creative thinking. So each moment of eye contact, each new word exchanged, each time you make a child laugh, you are strengthening these connections. And since there are so many different ways to do this, we ask people around the world, send us videos of your favorite ways to engage with the children in your life. During these early years, a child's brain makes as many connections as possible. And then it begins pruning the ones that aren't used and strengthening the ones that are. A dynamic process that continues throughout life. But since a child's brain is activated by everything it encounters, it can also be overwhelmed, which causes stress. When the brain experiences stress, the body's alarm system is activated. If the stress is relieved quickly, the system easily returns to normal. And while learning to deal with stress is an important part of development, severe situations such as ongoing abuse or neglect, where there is no caring adult to relieve the stress, leaves the body's alarm system activated, which can have serious lifelong consequences for the child. This is known as toxic stress. Toxic stress can lead to a body system set permanently on high alert. It causes the synapses we use for learning and self-control to be pruned, while connections for fear and rash behavior get stronger. While the brain can change throughout the rest of life, these early years are fundamental in building a strong foundation for curiosity, creativity, and adaptability.
Now I'd like to talk about the neuroplasticity of the brain. And the previous video that I just showed you, I showed you because it gives a nice example of how our brain is actually constructed and how it works, in that it basically creates different links and networks between different neurons to create those connections for us. And this is how learning occurs. Basically, when we are focusing our attention or concentration on a certain thing, it stimulates one certain area of the brain. And the more that we stimulate it, the more that the body tries to make up for that and increase the electrical impulses to that area of the brain. And then when the electrical impulses have met the requirement for that learning curve, then a connection gets made between that and a neighboring neuron. And that's when we realize something or we understand something. That's when we get that light bulb effect, where we are like, oh, okay, now that makes sense, right? Yep. And so every time we make a connection in the brain, we're strengthening our knowledge and understanding of our world and what we're learning about. This slide, I actually have some pictures here of different roads to give you a kind of a visual example and comparing it to our road network system. And so this first picture here is showing a road that obviously, or a trail that obviously doesn't get traveled nearly as much as this highway here. And so in comparison to the brain, this is like a nerve pathway in the brain that we don't use enough. We don't use very often. So now it's getting overgrown, or it's not, the nerve impulses and electrical conductivity in that area aren't as high as they would be on an area in the brain where it's like this highway that we travel over that portion over and over again. So this highway would be something like our habitual responses to things. It's the things that the areas in the brain we travel so much that the connections are so strong that we automatically take that route versus obviously going down this not very trodden trail. And then this would be like an in-between state where it probably isn't quite a habit, but it's something that we think about quite a bit, but not nearly as much, obviously, as this highway, this habit that we have. We are continually, and the more that we follow this route, the stronger and stronger that nerve pathway gets. And that's how a personality is actually developed in a person, is when a child is young, like we had saw in that previous video, their brains are most active out of all stages in life, and at that point the child is making as many possible connections as it can in the brain, and that's what our baseline for knowledge is as a child. Our baseline for personality is that what we pick up on in those formative years, and then throughout our development, the effects of our environment and our social situations affect which of those pathways end up getting stronger and stronger and stronger. And then by the time we become an adult, we have a clear picture of our personality. Now, a portion of that is affected by our genetics, of course. That affects the structure of our brain as well. But a lot of our personality is also affected by our development and the interactions that we face throughout our childhood. But because our brain is neuroplastic, plastic, it is able to change and always grow new connections. It's not hardwired for one thing or the other. The only thing that, probably the reason why some people in the past had thought that the brain was hardwired, and once you get a certain age you really can't learn anything new, is just because over that long period of time, and especially in those formative years, those connections are able to be made very strong, and so it does make it a lot more difficult to change after you get older, because the connections and structure of your brain is so well established already. But I'm not saying that it's impossible. It's just going to take a lot more effort and a lot more consistent work. But it is doable, which is pretty cool. This picture here I think is super cool because it gives us a visual of the neurons. So neurons are your nerve cells, and this point right here, kind of where you see that light there, is called a synapse. It's a connection between one nerve cell and another nerve cell. That's that light bulb effect you get when you understand something, is when different nerve cells are connecting and synapsing. So if you've got a bunch of nerve cells synapsing, you're just like understanding a bunch of different things all at once, and it's all making sense. You're making so many connections. That's a good sign of a healthy brain, and a brain that isn't overwhelmed with toxins and stress. It's able to function optimally and make those connections as it should. But I would like to show you too is, let's say someone has a typical response to a certain situation. So ever since they were a child, they were taught that they needed to be afraid of failing, or they needed to make sure they succeeded, because otherwise their parents would end up, punishing them, or there would be consequences if they didn't do well in school or whatever. And so what that did is it created a reflexive response that whenever any new task came up that they needed to learn, they almost automatically would follow this one synapse to that fear state of, I need to succeed because otherwise there'll be a consequence. Then otherwise I won't be of value. I need to succeed. So they constantly travel that pathway. And unless they become aware of that pathway, they'll continue doing that, and it'll affect almost every aspect of their life if it's a very core, essential feeling that they had when they were a child in their development. And so I think it's important that we become aware of these core beliefs that we have, these beliefs that govern our actions, because what they are is they're basically so strong of a nerve connection, it's so habitual that we don't even realize that it's an option to think something else or think a different way about something. It's just so normal. I have this really neat video here that gives us another visual of the neuroplasticity of the brain and how cool that is and how it works. So I'm going to let you watch this, and so that you can get another good visual of how all of that works.
Not so long ago, many scientists believed that the brain did not change after childhood, that it was hardwired and fixed by the time we became adults. But recent advances in only the last decade now tell us that this is simply not true. The brain can and does change throughout our lives. It is adaptable, like plastic. Hence, neuroscientists call this neuroplasticity. How does neuroplasticity work? If you think of your brain as a dynamic, connected power grid, there are billions of pathways or roads lighting up every time you think, feel, or do something. Some of these roads are well-travelled. These are our habits, our established ways of thinking, feeling, and doing. Every time we think in a certain way, practice a particular task, or feel a specific emotion, we strengthen this road. It becomes easier for our brains to travel this pathway. Say we think about something differently, learn a new task, or choose a different emotion. We start carving out a new road. If we keep travelling that road, our brains begin to use this pathway more, and this new way of thinking, feeling, or doing becomes second nature. The old pathway gets used less and less and weakens. This process of rewiring your brain by forming new connections and weakening old ones is neuroplasticity in action. The good news is that we all have the ability to learn and change by rewiring our brains. If you have ever changed a bad habit or thought about something differently, you have carved a new pathway in your brain and experienced neuroplasticity firsthand. With repeated and directed attention towards your desired change, you can rewire your brain.
So now that we know that the brain is neuroplastic and we can change it, what are some steps that we can take to do this? So I've put together a little mini protocol that we can use to work on that sort of thing. So the first step would be you've got to identify the core negative thinking patterns that you have from childhood. What are those deep recurrent thoughts that you continually go to over and over and over again? No matter what situation, it seems like you always go back to that one thing and you're just like, oh, here it is again, I just can't get rid of it. This must be who I am. That's one of those core negative thinking patterns that's been well traveled. So we'll have to, then once we figure out what those recurrent thinking patterns are, we can start challenging them, asking the questions, what if and why do we think this? Is it really that logical to think this way, or is it just something that's completely habitual and we've learned how to do from either our parents or just, how we had coped with stress at a young age? And then thirdly, we can develop habitual counteraction patterns, so new thinking patterns to counteract the negative thought patterns that stimulate stress response in the body. So by creating positive new patterns, we can learn to not experience as much stress, even though our environments may have things that come up that cause or should stimulate a lot of stress for most people. So sorry, this is written kind of small, but here's just some examples of some core beliefs that some people will have that kind of drive their actions and drive their life and drive them to, chronic fatigue and depression. So one example would be the belief that they are worthless. So it seems like no matter what they do, anytime something goes wrong or any event happens, they're always like, it's because, I'm just not good enough, or I don't have worth, I can't do what I need to do. People don't appreciate me. I'm deep down just, there's no significance to my existence as kind of their core belief. And then there's the failing is unacceptable. So those people are so driven, they drive themselves to stress because they have this belief that if they fail, then they'll be unacceptable to themselves, unacceptable to all their friends and family, and they can't bear to face that rejection. But really, it's just a figment of their mind. It's not necessarily going to happen. And then another one would be, I don't have what it takes to do self-healing, or I am basically a weak person, or no one ever listens to me, or I will get the illness, Mr. M, or so-and-so God, or I will die from this, or I'm not lovable, or I'm undeserving of love. I cannot be assertive without danger. Love will go away, and I can never keep love around, or love will smother me is another belief, or I will inevitably be abandoned by the people that I love, or I am just a flat-out failure, or I don't deserve abundance, health, happiness, wellness, success. So those are just some examples of some of the beliefs that we have, some things that we learned in our childhood and that have been so strengthened in our brain that we automatically think those things, and they create a lot of stress for us. Is what we need to work on then is identifying what those are, and then coming up with counteractive positive things instead. So on the previous slide here, I have a link to Dr. Grayson, Henry Grayson. He has a PDF file here with a list of different, well, it's kind of like a questionnaire to help you identify your negative core beliefs. And so you're welcome to click on that link or follow that link and take that quiz for yourself so that you can start identifying what those core beliefs are for you. So the next portion is that we need to really work on challenging these negative thinking patterns. So let's say we're just going to have a hypothetical person named Marcy. And so Marcy just got out of a 2-year-long wonderful relationship with this guy that she really loved, and in the end, though, it ended very badly. He broke up with her. He didn't like her in the end, and so how she responded to that situation is how her stress levels got so high and how she ultimately ended up with chronic fatigue. She responded to the situation with the fact that, oh, I am worthless, or no one ever loves me anyways, and instead of thinking, well, maybe it just maybe me and Josh just weren't right for each other, and maybe this is all for the better. Maybe I'll find someone that's even better than Josh later down the road. No, she didn't think that way. She thought, no, he broke up with me because I'm worthless and no one will ever want me ever again. And so she's going off the deep end because she thinks that she's never going to find love again. But she doesn't need to think that way. And it's very likely that in several months she's going to get over this breakup and she's going to move on, and she's going to start, going out with other guys, and she's going to find a great guy that she likes just as much or more than Josh. But yes, she has to go through that crazy emotional turmoil because the way that she's thinking this, the way she's responding to the situation. So what she would need to do is, after that situation, instead of just going right to her habitual thinking pattern that she's developed from her childhood, she should go ask some of these questions like, what is the worst that could happen? So now that Josh has broke up with me, what is the worst that could possibly happen to me? Maybe he broke up with me, but it's not, obviously I'm still here, and I still have, maybe family that that love me still. It's not life and death situation. She can think of it, she can compare it to worse situations in order to help her realize that this isn't as bad as she's making it out to be currently. Or she could ask the question, like, what are some other ways that she could think about this? Like we had discussed earlier, instead of thinking, irrationally and thinking and using her whole old negative thinking pattern, she could develop a more positive thinking pattern that offers her hope versus depression. And then she could, once she's realized this is her thinking pattern, she could say, why do I think that this is true? Why do I think that just because Josh broke up with me, that no one else will want me? And she can probably trace it back to the fact that that's how she felt as a child at some point. And then she can realize that it's not necessarily the situation that's causing her to feel this way, but it's the things that happened to her in the past, and that she just needs to let go of those things and move on and look and be hopeful and think positively about her future. And then when those thoughts automatically come in and start repeating themselves like that, you really kind of start to realize that those are probably your core beliefs, your negative thinking patterns. And so you can start writing them down and paying attention to whenever those come into your head, and realize that they aren't necessarily true. They are just there because they're habitual, they're reflexive. So I've got this great video that gives a good example of how we can work on rewiring our brains so that we can respond to stressful situations in a more positive way.
People ask me, Brendan, how do I reprogram my mind? And I'm like, That's kind of creepy. Are you a cyborg? Like, why did somebody one time like ninjutsu your brain and hypnotize you into thinking something horrible? Like, why do you need to reprogram anything? Most adults don't need to reprogram something. They just need to program it for the first time. You know, it's like there was never actually any programming that happened anywhere. There were just all these patterns of incidences and these circumstances that have all coalesced into sort of these automatic thoughts and behaviors that they aren't necessarily being responsible for. They come up automatically and they happen to them. It's not like someone said, I want you to think this, I want you to think this, I want you to... No one ever sat you down and probably just like, woo, maybe it happened, but for most people, that never happened. What they're really saying is, Brendan, I need to get a hold of my mind, man, because sometimes I just got these constant negative recurring thoughts that come up. I can't get rid of them, or sometimes I get obsessed about this one bad thing that happened to me, or sometimes I say, I just can't even control my attention, dude. So what they're really struggling to do is to master their mind in a more sort of capable way. So let's talk about how your thoughts are generated. And some of this you might already know. If you've read my book, The Charge, or you've seen some of my other work in High Performance Academy, we talk a lot about how do you master your psychology. I'm going to give you one simple framework to think through, and then some tips and tools and strategies you can immediately input into your life to better manage your mind. The first thing, if you're having negative recurring thoughts and feelings that are coming up, those are really, they're easy. And here's what I mean by that. We kind of have two systems of thought, psychologists like to say now. We have the System 1 theories, in which the System 1 is your automatic, just unconscious, immediate thoughts and impulses that come up from your body that usually your brain is just saying, hey dude, we've thought through this before, or hey dude, we're trying to protect you. So it's running at a very baseline, easy, energetic level. Your brain loves to optimize itself. It doesn't like to have to do a whole lot of thinking. It just likes to say, what do we already know? How can we apply it to this situation? So if you had fears in the past and a similar situation is here, your body just generates those fears and says, hey man, run away again. If you had challenges in the past and you want to protect yourself, your brain just says, hey, protect yourself right now, we're worried about this. But sometimes those are not helpful thoughts. They're automatic, but they're not actually helpful. It's just your brain saying this is the easiest route we know. And part of becoming a more mature, conscious, enlightened person is to better take control of our System 2, which is our sort of conscious dashboard on our mind, our ability to more directly work, control, generate, and create our own thoughts and behaviors in the moment, not relying too much on just the things that come up for us. Now, of course, we're always going to. Most of our lives is very System 1 driven, very unconscious, automatic. We're just going through the motions. But the people who achieve the peak amounts of success, the highest performers in the world, have said, you know what? I need to discipline my mind to support me even when it comes up with an automatic, immediate thoughts. I want those to be positive and buoyant and confident and strong, something that leads me to healthy decisions for my life, not just things that protect me. And so I think that we have to learn how to do that. One of the simple ways to do that is this framework to understand how thoughts develop into strong and automatic thoughts in our lives. I call the framework RWID, which stands for relative, weight, of importance, and duration. People often who have negative recurring thoughts and feelings in their life, the reason those keep coming up all the time is because they at some point in their life or continually are giving those thoughts, the negative ones, more attention than necessarily any other thoughts. In other words, the relative weight that they give those thoughts is quite high. And they give a lot of importance to them. So those thoughts are very important to me right now. And they're durational, they last over a period of time. They keep thinking about those thoughts, thinking about those thoughts, thinking about those thoughts. And it's all that repetition that seals it in the back of their head. And now their head says, oh, this is an easy thing. I know this one, and it pulls it forward. So that simple repetition, because they made it important and they thought about it a lot, it keeps coming up for them over and over and over again. So there's a good negative thing about that and a positive thing. The negative is, if you keep obsessing about negative things, your mind will be automatically conditioned to bring it up more and more and more often without your control, just automatically. The positive aspect is we can use that same skill set and that same rule to apply positive thoughts into our own life. We can give positive thinking positive questions, positive approaches to life, a lot of importance in our life, and a lot of focus, and focus on them and give a lot of duration to them over a period of time, and they get sealed in the brain as well. And now the brain says, well, that's easy, automatically thinks about it. So for me personally, I've done this so much in my life that I automatically think about the best possible outcomes in almost everything I do. I used to think about the negative outcomes. I thought, that's not supporting me. So how did I do that? Well, leveraging RWID, it helped. And let me break it down for you a little bit about how you can do this, because the first thing you have to do in order to improve your mind is take total control of your attention. And notice, where are your thoughts right now? At a very continual basis, you have to think, where are my thoughts right now? Are they supporting me, or are they automatically coming up negative and self-protective in ways that are not advancing my life? Just to be aware, to be conscious of what's going on in your body, in your sense of feeling and emotion, and the sense of the thoughts you're actually having. Just start paying attention. You know, for a lot of people, because they've never done this before and it's hard to remind them to do it, it's like simple. Here's what I want you to do. Just start paying attention to your thoughts anytime you're in line. Anytime you're in line from now on. If you're in line at Starbucks, just say, I'm in line at Starbucks. Brendan said, think about my thoughts. What are my thoughts saying right now? Just checking in. You're in line in traffic, waiting for the next car. Just sit and think, what are my thoughts right now? And just notice what you've been thinking about. The more we notice what we've been thinking about, the more we can interrupt what we've been thinking about. See, if we just allow that feeling to keep coming up and we don't pay attention to it, our life can be very frazzled and very highly anxious. But once we say, what's my mind on right now? And we redirect it, that is where personal power comes from. First, awareness, right? And understanding and the consciousness to what's going on. But then the ability now to be self-directive, to choose what we want to focus on. So first we're attentive to it, and then redirect it. If it's negative, it's not supporting you, redirect it. How do you redirect it? First and foremost, you just say, what would be the opposite of this negative thing? Then you think about the positive thing, and you focus on that, and you repeat it to yourself. For many people, that might include closing their eyes, just visualizing a more positive outcome. Thinking about the more positive outcome. Thinking about the more positive outcome. Thinking about the more positive outcome. Focusing on it with their eyes closed. And that visualization of a more positive outcome, of how things could turn out well, or how the situation could be better, or even just what are the next steps I should take. Visualizing that and assigning a high amount of importance and duration to it, meaning making that thing important to us by making it, how do you make something important? You give it a sensation. You feel that thing. You sense it. You sense what your next step would be. You sense how it would feel if the outcome would be better. How would it feel emotionally, psychologically, spiritually for that thing to be up? Allow it to have a lot of emotion to it. Pay attention to it. Your eyes closed, you see that thing, you feel it, you sense a different step, you know what you're going to do, you pay attention to it, and you keep focusing on that, just over a period of minutes. Keep focusing and keep focusing and focusing. When your mind automatically wants to go back to the easy, which might be negative, you go, no. I'm not into easy right now. I'm into conditioning my mind. Focus, 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 focus. Give attention, duration, and sensation to it. Attention, duration, sensation. Attention, duration, sensation. Visualization, visualization, visualization. It's repetition of that positive alternative to a negative impulse that comes up that gives us personal power. Let me say that again. It's that attention to that positive alternative over attention to repeating that negative impulse or thought that gives us personal power. It's not that we're going to someday wake up in the perfect world in which we don't have negative thoughts. There's plenty of times I struggle too. I come up with this, I'm thinking about a new dream, a new goal. I'm going to go interview some major celebrity, or we got a big time celebrity client, and I get a little nervous, and I can start thinking about all these negative things that could happen if I screw up. My mind immediately interrupts that now, because my mind goes, relative weight of importance and duration, Brendan. You can either give this thought more time and energy and focus, or you can just stop it and force your brain, creatively force it to direct it to a different possible alternative. Force it. Literally go, oh, I'm sensing this negative thing over here is coming up for me. I'm sensing it. Stop. Okay, get to work, brain. What positive thing could I create and focus on? And close your eyes and think about it and focus on it and focus on it and focus on it and build it out. Make it elaborate in your own mind so you can visualize and see it and feel it and focus on it, focus on it, focus on it. Literally, later on in the evening, focus on it again, focus on it again. You start building in that capacity. Now, if this all sounds way too philosophical and you're like, dude, how do I land this? How do I make it happen? Here's a very simple thing you can do to reprogram your mind. Create a sheet of 2 simple things, very simple things. I want you to write 5 questions down that you're going to ask yourself 3 or 4 times a day. 5 questions that are positive for yourself. Every day, you're going to wake up in the morning, you're going to read these questions to yourself, you're going to answer them. You're going to read them, you're going to answer them. Every morning. Then at lunch, read the questions, answer them. At night, read the questions, answer them. These can be questions like, what could I feel incredibly grateful for right now? How could I surprise or flirt with somebody right now? How could I have fun right now? Positive things like that, right? How could I demonstrate love or excellence right now? Ask these questions in the morning. Ask them in the afternoon. Ask them at night. By asking these positive questions over and over, I mean, you just do this for 30 days, you're going to recognize a total shift in your life. Just simple questions, but you're giving them weight by focusing on them 3 times during the day. You're having duration by focusing on it 3 times during a day over 30 days. Your mind starts to reshift its gears to give automatic ease to answering those questions and living in that mindset versus an undirected, unconscious mindset. Second thing on that sheet, or those things you can do, 5 questions first. Second thing I want you to do is come up with 3 words that describe your ideal self. Just 3 words. You know, mine are, for example, present, excited, and bold. So I'm going to focus on those questions 3 times a day as well. What I do is I put them on my iPhone, and they come up as an alarm 3 different times during the day. Just my phone buzzes, and those words are there. I'm like, oh, right, I'm that guy. I got to focus on being that guy versus whatever I might be in a bad mood. I'm like, and completely detached. And then I look, I'm like, dude, no, I'm an excited person. Break that thought. Get back into this. Got it. This is who I am. And now that might sound so simple. Simpy? It sounds so simple. But guess what? People won't do the discipline. They are so frustrated with their mind because they haven't done the conscious discipline to reprogram it. That's the last thought here. Yes, we all have unconscious thoughts, every single person of us. If you don't have a mental disorder, and then guess what? You have extreme power in your life to overtake it. And even those who have mental disorders, psychologists and therapists work with them to recondition their mind by allowing them a different way of attaching meaning to the past incidences. But even if they attach a different meaning to the past, the whole focus is bring them into today and teach them to use their mind to direct itself into positive orientations, to make healthier decisions, to enact healthier behaviors. If you can just focus on getting more attentive to what you're feeling, and then do these thought exercises. What questions? Who do I want to be? And you do that over and over again, everything changes. Last thought, our unconscious and our mind is incredibly programmed not just by thought, which is what I've been talking about, relative weight of importance and duration, focusing our attention on what questions we would ask ourselves, what positive alternatives can we create for ourselves, what labels can we create for ourselves to support us. But our mind also is incredibly conditioned by action, behavior. You've heard the term like fake it till you make it. I don't love that. I'd rather just say, just be authentic over and over and over and over again, right? If you take action on a consistent basis, it teaches your mind to do that. So do things that are positive for yourself. Take bolder actions. Teach yourself, I'm just going to be confident, just for no other reason. Watch my video on being confident here on YouTube. I want you to really think about this. The more that you take action, the more your brain gets automatically conditioned to understand that's what we do. Hey man, that's just what we do. We just react to bad situations like this because that's how we've done it. You can actually condition your mind without doing any thought other than just behaving in a more positive manner. And suddenly you find yourself thinking more positively. I know it sounds duplicitous, but word is duplicitous? I think it's word. Sounds good. Good word. It's like a $10 word right there. That's a big word for a Montanan. But I really want you to think about that. Your actions condition your mind as much as your recurring thoughts condition your mind. So be a person of good, positive thinking. Be a person of good, positive action. And suddenly one day you'll wake up and you're like, I just feel amazing. I feel extraordinary. I feel positive. And that's what it feels like to live the charged life.
So I really love what Brandon had to say about how we can rewire our brains just by changing the way that we think, becoming aware of those negative thoughts, and then reprogramming our thoughts by consciously thinking about the opposite. I think that is very vital in order for us to be able to learn how to cope with the everyday stress in a more healthy way. So I'm really glad that you guys got a chance to watch my video here on cleansing your mind for better health and happiness. I also have some other videos in this cleansing series as well, so you're welcome to watch those. I have part 1, part 2, part 3, part 4, and they will be on nutrition, liver cleansing, and breathing exercises as well. Again, thank you for watching. Feel free to subscribe to my channel below.